Rachel had only another week left before she had to return to university to start the second year of her course. The news reports in the last few weeks had been giving coverage to rising tensions overseas. A small Asian country with nuclear capabilities had been flexing their muscle in the region for quite some months now. The country's president, a military man, was opposed to interference from larger Western countries, which had been negotiating with him to dismantle their nuclear weapons. He insisted other countries in this region also possessed these weapons, and he needed to ensure his country's safety by retaining them. The negotiations had ended in a stalemate, with the refusal of any reduction in the country's deadly arsenal. Alliances were becoming strained, as more and more countries vied into the argument. Whatever the outcome, though, it was clear that the small Asian man with the square glasses, the military president, was not going to be told what to do. One night, later that week, when Rachel's family were about to sit down to dinner, Rachel's mum went to go to the kitchen to grab the plates. On her return, she passed by the television, which had the volume turned down earlier that evening. There was a large crash and the sound of plates breaking. Rachel and her father rushed in to see what had happened. Her mother was standing, watching in disbelief, television news report. Her father grabbed the remote control, turning the sound up to a more audible level. The small Asian country had launched a nuclear attack on one of its larger neighbours. The result had been a returned attack with such ferocity it had all but annihilated the military president's entire region. It was classed as an overreaction and led to any countries in the vicinity of the blast being now covered with deadly radioactive clouds. Millions of people were already dead or dying. The huge blast had also affected the coastline. The shockwaves were sending giant tsunamis hundreds of miles across the ocean and were due to hit Rachel's country's coastline at any time soon. Rachel and her parents were probably far enough inland to be safe from the huge waves, but the real fear now was Rachel's country was making ready to launch their own attack. The intelligence reports that had been intercepted made it clear that they were to be targeted for their interference in the negotiations. It was total madness. The whole world, it seemed, was suddenly out of control. The evil, the greed, the hatred and self-centeredness of the people of the world, seemed, had taken over, and now the world was set to self-destruct around them all. Within minutes of them seeing the television broadcast, the first images of the surging waters consuming the coastline began to be shown. They were taken from the air and showed large areas of coastal cities now demolished as the water continued its journey inland. Soon the water would reach its limit and recede back to its former outlines, taking everything it had torn away during its peak with it. Rachel and her mum and dad all stood holding each other. They were tearful but quiet. What was there to say? Suddenly, the floor began to shake underfoot. The walls were cracking and the windows were shattering. A massive earthquake was occurring deep in the ground, and its epicenter was only a few kilometres from Rachel's town. They scurried out into the street. There was a large crack forming in the street, about half a block away from them. People from the whole length of the street had ran from their houses, and their terrified screams could be heard above the groaning of the earth. Even though the sun had not yet set, it was getting very hard to see. The sun looked like a giant red globe as it peered through the smoky haze. A transformer on a set of power lines 2 doors up exploded, and the power pole came crashing down on top of a car. Rachel and her mum and dad could do nothing more than stand on the footpath of their now partly demolished home and watch terrified as the scene unfolded around them. Ping! Something hit Rachel's shoulder. Ping! Ping! Hailstones the size of peas were beginning to fall on them. Could there be anything else? Rachel's father did his best to shield his wife and daughter with the jacket he was wearing, but to no avail. A huge storm was whipping up all around them. As the storm's ferocity grew, so did the size of the hailstones. They were now as big as marbles, and people were screaming, trying to cover their heads. There was nowhere to hide from the onslaught. Just then, above the noise of the thunder, Rachel could hear a sound like music. It was like an orchestra building in intensity, playing way too fast. "Rachel!" a voice boomed in her ears. It was so loud that she tried to cover them with her hands. "Rachel, it's time to come home." She looked up into the sky, way up. The clouds were moving across the sky in a continuous motion. They were so fast you could hardly keep up with them. Suddenly, the clouds disappeared, and she could see right through a tear in the sky into the heavens above. There were comets and shooting stars crisscrossing the sky. Rachel recognized the scene from a dream she once had. She wasn't at all surprised when at last the stars too were torn away. You could see once more the bright flashing colours spiralling upwards into the circle of light. It was a long way off, it seemed, right out at the edge of the Earth's atmosphere. Rachel at last knew just what she had to do. If they stayed here any longer, they were likely to become victims of the ferocious storm raging all around. Her instincts took over. She knew how to save her parents from a self-destructing world. Rachel held tightly onto her mother and father's hands, shaking with a mixture of fear and excitement. The wind was swirling all around them, and although the hail, now the size of cricket balls, was still falling, it no longer touched them. Rachel was being drawn by the noise and the swirling lights, upward into the sky. Her mother and father were rising up with her, and although they were petrified, Rachel's voice came to them, soft and steady, calming and positive. "We're going home," was all that she said to them. They both nodded quietly. Even though they were at least 100 kilometers up in the air and flying fast, holding their daughter's hands, a peaceful, happy feeling filled them both. Time seemed to be standing still, as they both looked across at their daughter with amazement. She was dressed in long white robes, and her hair was a mass of golden curls. Everything about her was glowing. As they flew ever upwards towards the circle of light, they became aware that they were not alone. Everywhere, all around them, there were other people visible. All of them were accompanied by a glowing figure, bathed in clean white light. Way up at the light circle, it seemed to be being bombarded from every direction with small beams of light. There was music all around them. It seemed to be pulsing forwards out of the light circle. They weren't far off from it now, and their pace had steadied, as if they had to wait their turn for approach. Rachel looked around her. There amongst the stars with a backdrop of swirling colours was Zeb. He was holding on to Stephen and Deborah. They were all laughing and smiling, and as Rachel watched, they disappeared into the light. The Negro man from the bridge went past them, with a mother and a small baby. The woman flew at his arm while he held the baby in close to him. He beamed a huge smile at Rachel and called out, "Welcome home," as they disappeared into the light before her very eyes. Finally, it was Rachel's turn. They were pulled into the centre of the light circle and out the other side. They were still flying through what seemed like a tunnel of coloured light, but Rachel was no longer holding her parents' hands. They too were now dressed in brilliant white robes, and they flew on their own, by Rachel's side. Rachel awoke with a start. She was lying on her back, being bathed in the sun's warmth. She could hear the sound of waves as they gently broke on the shore. She opened her eyes and surveyed the sky. It was a brilliant coloured blue with not a single cloud in sight. She wondered how long she'd been lying there dreaming. Then she remembered. Mum and Dad, Zeb, Stephen and Deborah, the storm. She leapt to her feet and surveyed the crystal white sands of the beach for her family. There were people a long way off, down at the shoreline. Children frolicking at the water's edge. She couldn't see them anywhere. She began to panic. 4 little children, 3 girls and a boy, ran past her, laughing and giggling. Their feet scuffed upon the snow-white sands as they went. She watched them with amazement as they ran down the beach together to their parents. Just at that moment, she felt a warm hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Stephen, smiling at her. "Thanks, Rachel, for everything." Not far off were her mum and dad, Deborah also. They were all walking towards her. Then, just behind them, Rachel spotted Tamara. She was walking hand in hand with a familiar friend of Rachel's. As they finally stood before her, Tamara said, "Rachel, I'd like you to meet my boyfriend. His name is Zeb." Rachel and Zeb both just smiled and nodded as they shook each other's hands. Further down the beach, standing next to the shoreline, Rachel noticed a lone figure. A man, dressed in white robes. His hair, long and golden, being gently ruffled by the sea breeze. He held out his hands to Rachel, and as Rachel and her family made their way towards him, she realised that she was truly home. The group stopped short of the man and allowed Rachel to walk on to him by herself. Rachel looked into his eyes. They were blue, like the ocean, intense. They were strangely familiar. They were the same as Rachel's eyes. He embraced her and pulled her into his chest. A tear rolled down her cheek and he wiped it away. Rachel had, at last, met her true father. The end. But it's not really the end. For the end, for the true believers, is really just the beginning. Amen.